Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the course pop-up for Strategic Foresight. My name is Aishwarya Gupta. I will be teaching this class in the fall, and we're having this pop-up to introduce some of the concepts and give you a walkthrough of what class will be like in Strategic Foresight. As I continue to present to you, I would like everyone to enter any questions that come up in the Q&A. I will take them at the end during the Q&A session. And, with that, we can go ahead and get started. Just a little bit of background about myself. I was a former CGA student. I graduated a little over 5 years ago, seems like a long time, but since then I've worked at Morgan Stanley, Ernst & Young, and I'm currently at Mitsubishi Financial Group. I'm a vice president in the Global Financial Crimes Division. And scenarios have always, intrigued me. I've worked with scenarios a lot. It's something, some of the concepts, some of the processes that I've learned through strategic foresight and scenarios, that's something I've carried through in my job even till today. And that's why, this course is near and dear to me. It gave me the rigor to sort of understand what strategic foresight means and really understand the nuances of research. So a portion of this course is, of course, focused on developing scenarios. So with that said, I'm going to jump into, just a brief overview of what scenarios are. And I really want to focus today's session on scenario methodologies and how they came about. So just a little bit of background for those of you who are new to the concept of scenarios. What are scenarios? Scenarios are basically planning approaches that we take to account for linear and disruptive changes. These are narrative in format. They come up with different types of outcomes. And the whole idea is to challenge mindsets in the policy arena, right? So you're looking at the plausibility and impact of known unknowns or wildcard events. You're testing current policies against future implications to determine what the risk will be. And it allows you to make well-informed decisions about long-term strategic options. So what are the values of value of having scenarios, right? One of them is really you start to deconstruct and scrutinize assumptions and challenge really prevailing beliefs on concepts that exist in the geopolitical landscape. That's the context of a lot of this class. But again, we'll delve into how this applies across multiple sectors, right? And then you begin to, as you go through the scenario exercise, you begin to recognize the flow of events, observe patterns, and it allows you to be in a setting that veers away from groupthink. So you want contrarians involved in scenarios, and really by deconstructing and improving the recognition of these patterns, scenarios really help us prepare for outcomes and minimize any uncertainties associated with any kind of future events, right? They could be long-term, short-term, but it allows you to really think about everything non-linearly in terms of a course of events. So when you look at the history of scenarios, how did they come up? So in the 1950s, Rand Corporation was founded at the end of World War II to research new forms of weapons technology. So at that time, they were looking for new ideas and new ways to think about the future. So Herman Kahn at Rand Corporation popularized the concept of scenarios. Now, if you want a little bit of a fun fact, the word scenarios actually came at the same time when Hollywood developed the concept of screenplay. So Herman Kahn was really intrigued by this idea, and he was more interested in the storytelling and the narrative. So of course, in a government and political sphere, using something like screenplay is not very formal. So he termed the word scenarios to formalize it. And then, as time went on, it became more popular in the military and strategic planning space. So in the 60s, Herman Kahn founded the Hudson Institute, which specialized in what's called unthinkable futures. It was at that time, it caught the attention of many because it was really focused on how a nuclear war can be won. And that was one of, the unthinkable futures that Herman Kahn was focused on. At the same time, on the West Coast, we had the Stanford Research Institute, where they began, taking these approaches for scenarios, taking them out of just the military space and applying them to policymaking. So here you see the evolution of like, how did it come from a military and strategic planning space, went into the government, and then in the 70s, and this is really when scenarios took off across multiple sectors. That's when Royal Dutch Shell began applying scenario planning. So the way Royal Dutch Shell worked is that they began with a strategic planning group. It was not focused on like forward-looking things, but more so to mitigate risk. In 68, they started something called a horizon year planning to look at, what does Royal Dutch Shell look like 5 years from now or 10 years from now? So the outcome was they came up with the scenario approach, and that scenario approach gave them some really valuable insights. The fact that oil prices were volatile, the fact that it's going to be a commodity and it's going to be something that's subject to market manipulation at many points in time. And really, when that proved to be true after the oil crisis in the 70s, and then subsequently in the 80s too, that's when the utility of scenarios really came to the fore. And then came up multiple methodologies. And what we're going to focus on is 6 methodologies. This is a brief overview. In the class, we will, of course, delve into each of these specifically and really understand the core of how these methodologies came up, what are the actual steps, and really like how did they differ from each other, and where are we now, and what methodology do we use? So one consensus that all of these methodologies had is that there should be a minimum of 3 scenarios, and there should be a consideration of plausible combinations of key factors, right? So plausibility is the underlying theme. You're not creating fantasy. This is not fan fiction. This is not, an exercise in what could be potentially. It's very much rooted in real world events and the probability of those occurring, right? So the Delphi method was what Rand initially used. So their methodology was focused on forecast aggregation. Here, they were really asking experts to estimate the probability of events occurring. So how they did this was they developed questionnaires and they put it to a group of experts, right? And you'll hear the word experts come up again and again in the scenario space. So what it means is someone who is well-versed in the topic that you're interested in. And they would collate their resumes, look at who would be appropriate for this exercise. And they wanted everyone who had a gamut of experience from all, different industries who had some touch on the topic. They would prepare these questionnaires, test them. And what they would ask is not only to just talk to what is the possibility of something happening, but they assigned probabilities to something, some event occurring in the future. And for those of you who've taken, IR futures, will be familiar with some of Tetlock's work and super forecasting IARPA's exercises, they kind of have like that similar strain, right? So where you're forecasting specific events and then looking at the convergence of those probabilities. So when you have different experts all opining on what they believe the likelihood of something happening is, and you look at the convergence and what the consensus is, and then delve into your scenarios from there. The one good thing about the Delphi method is that it anonymized expert responses. So it gave them, the freedom to actually express what they truly understood and believed, as opposed to being driven by, I can't have this conclusion associated with me. So it helped create a more holistic environment for these experts to opine in. Then we had the shell scenarios, right? And this is closest to where we are today. So Shell has a methodology called expert scenarios. And what does expert scenarios really mean? It means that, you have a lot of different steps, but they're focused primarily on experts in the field. So Shell is obviously focused on the oil and gas industry. They would bring in experts within their sphere, and they would ask them to go through and identify key factors, develop drivers, and scenario logics. Now, scenario logics, which is again a common term used throughout like the different methodologies, is basically a trial and error, right? The interaction of drivers and coming up with plausible scenarios, right? Something cannot be completely out of the realm of possibility. So again, it's a qualitative exercise on Shell's part, but the difference that you'll notice with Shell, as opposed to scenarios that you may be exposed through the Good Judgment Project or through Professor Oppenheimer's work, is that the end result is coming up with key indicators, and this is something that industry organizations like oil and gas, financial institutions, they all use this because they don't need a policy outcome on what you need to consider. They need indicators. So what Shell does is they come up with indicators internally to monitor the possibility of these scenarios occurring. So while we're focused on the policy side, they're actually focused on, okay, what will tell us when this event is starting to occur? So let's map out in like 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, what are we looking for in the market? So that kind of drives what Shell does. And the other thing that Shell starts with is that they will start with a set of like 7 or 8 scenarios. Then they dwindle down based on, experts, expert opinions, as well as what the data is telling them. They dwindle down to about 3 or 4. And I encourage everyone on this call to at least explore the Shell scenarios. They have a terrific program that they work, to this day, and continue to be like a front runner in scenario planning. Then the next methodology is the Stanford Research Institute. Now, you had very specific industries employing, scenario planning, but when you move into the policy realm, SRI did something that was a little bit more unique at the time, because if you're focusing on, one sector specifically, your drivers tend to get very specific. Right? So if you're focusing on, say, economic policy, you're looking at GDP, you're looking at growth rate, and you're looking at some other factors that will, drive the economy. But what Intuitive Logics, which is the SRI approach, they started focusing on identifying environmental forces. Now, environmental forces doesn't mean just, the overall environment. Here you're also talking about undertones, like key themes. And this is where, you started to build out all these concepts of, sociological factors. You're looking at demographics. You're looking at the political landscape of a country when you start to look at those scenarios. And then they also did something unique, because up until that SRI, all the scenarios were really short and focused, but they started elaborating on the scenarios and they began analyzing the implications. And in the policy realm, this became, really important, because you're starting to test policy approaches, right? You're no longer just in this realm of, could it be or could it not be true, but you're also looking at it from a very unique perspective, in that it's starting to give you outcomes that you need to review. Then the next three set that came after: basics, futures group, and interacts. Now these are kind of iterations of the same three methods, but they introduce additional factors, and that's what has brought us to the scenario methodology that's here today. So basics introduced this concept of the structuring areas of influence and preparing a cross-impact matrix. So what that means is you start mapping uncertainties and coming up with scenarios based on uncertainties as underlying themes. They also incorporated assigning probabilities to forecasts to study those implications. And the futures group then took it a step further, and this is where the narratives that we see today in scenarios have come up, because up until that time, everyone was working backwards from an end. The futures group started doing a trend impact analysis. So they would look at time series data. They would extrapolate that data. It wasn't very extensive, but it could be, depending on the narrative or the scenario. And then they would establish the probability of an event occurring, and then write extensive narratives to show you how you get there, to form a logical sequence of events from start to finish. And that became really important, because up until the futures group, a lot of scenarios focus on the outcomes and the indicators and specific events. So the narratives were really not as robust as you would see today in a scenario. And then you had interacts, which was modeling scenarios, and they incorporated elements of the cross-impact analysis method and event probability distributions, and they began running models. So that's basically, where we see financial institutions using modeling scenarios as well. So, for example, like Basel has a requirement for stress testing using scenarios. So a lot of financial institutions use this methodology to run models. Of course, they've built up on it since then, and they essentially, test a number of outcomes and make sure they're at a liquidity capital threshold at a certain level. We're going to, discuss that as well in the class further. But overall, this is essentially where the methodologies originated from and contribute to the methodology that we will study in the class as well while we develop scenarios. So with that, I do want to open it up to questions, and please enter your questions in the Q&A. If there are no open questions, there's going to be, we're going to have time to address some of the utilities, which I want to talk about as well. So a common question comes up, it seems like this sphere of scenarios is rather limited. There's only a few organizations doing it, or that you don't know exactly how these scenarios will, this class will help you. So strategic foresight covers a lot more than just scenarios. It instills you with really good research skills. We start talking about biases in both research and sources, as well as cognitive biases and how to avoid them. A lot of the coursework will focus on that and the research aspect of it as well. But scenarios are also, very widely used. So I do want to reiterate that, and if we don't have any questions, I'll share something else, which I had put together for one of the classes, to kind of demonstrate how exactly scenarios are used. So we have a question here. If there's any methodology we're going to be focusing on specifically from the six that I presented. So it's a really great question. We focus on sort of a combination of all of these but I also want to, caution that these methodologies this is where the history of these come from. And, at the end of the day, when you're looking at how you want to structure scenarios, we're probably going to be closest to the Royal Dutch Shell method and incorporating bits and pieces of a lot of things along the way. That's what we're going to be utilizing. So that's, which one we're going to be focusing on, but we will do a deep dive into all six so you understand exactly how scenarios can be, used in different spaces. So another question is, do any U.S. government organizations utilize any of these methodologies that I'm aware of? So we have, IARPA, of course. RAND Corporation has continued to do it. The National Intelligence Council scenarios, those can be reviewed too. I'm sure you guys are all aware of those. These are just some examples. The EPA has done scenarios on I think recently on climate change. Also, international governments constantly use scenarios and these methodologies for strategic planning exercises as well. So that's that. Concrete cases when any of these have accurately predicted crises. So, the jury's out on that. Again, I want to preface that scenario planning and, forecasting isn't meant to predict exact things. It's meant to make you aware and susceptible to different changes in that are occurring in a political environment or in a government organization of some sort. But I think the more important question is, we have tons of instances where if you look at the Good Judgment Project, they've had really great prediction rates or forecasting rates. We call it forecasting, and they've forecasted with a high probability that an event will occur. And their super forecasters specifically, are kind of known for their ability to pinpoint exactly, not exactly, but to the exact probability that they think an event is going to occur. So I'd encourage, everyone to take a look at the Good Judgment Project. And if you haven't read, Phil Tetlock's work, definitely take a look. So which of these models, I guess a follow-up is, what's the utility here? The utility isn't accuracy in prediction. The utility is more so making you aware of the realm of possibilities of things that could occur, and making sure you're looking at all the different angles and outcomes of a possible event. Yes, I could say, the scenarios I did in 2015 are really accurate right now in the current, you know, political space. But we're not looking for accuracy. We're not holding a crystal ball. So I think the idea is to make sure you're really aware and you challenge the basic assumptions that underlie these scenarios or events that are occurring. Which of these models prove more accurate? Can they be back tested? So we do cover, back testing in terms of models, and the idea of scenarios, and one of the basic tenets of forecasting is also consistently updating probabilities and making sure that they're applicable, and they're being updated as long as the events are occurring, because especially in the political landscape, new events may change your assessment of how probable an event is. So again, the Good Judgment Project was really designed to test how many of these forecasts were accurate. And there are many other such studies that are being conducted to see what the accuracy, so to speak, is. But more than the accuracy, here we focus on A, the methodology, and B, exactly, how you hold yourself accountable in a way when you're developing scenarios. Okay, so I think that is a lot of the questions that we received. I think one of the closing thoughts that I have here is this idea, again, we talk about scenarios and forecasting a lot in the class, and accuracy for forecasting is really, one of the basic tenets. But until the Good Judgment Project, there was really no barometer for testing predictions. So like if you have even a weather forecast, for example, the slightest change in, say, decimal points could throw off the percentage by which they're forecasting rain. So even the most basic forecasts are based on probability of something occurring, as opposed to like we are 100% certain that something will happen, that it will rain tomorrow. So the idea here is to take some of those forecasting techniques, apply them to scenario methodologies, developing scenarios that give you a fulsome understanding of a political landscape or the landscape in a particular crisis, and then inform policy decision around it. So again, the class isn't meant to focus on predictions. We focus more on forecasts and the probabilities of forecasts, as well as how to use some of these methodologies that have come up in our scenarios. So with that, I think we're almost at the end of the session. And I'd just like to thank everyone for attending, and we got a lot of great questions. Of course, feel free to reach out to me if you have any more questions. I'm happy to answer them, continue the conversation. And if you have questions about the class, we can discuss that as well. Again, thank you everyone for joining. It was great hearing your questions. I hope you enjoyed this session and hope to see some of you in class. Thank you.